Molweni, Dumelang, Sambonani, and welcome to the Avrik podcast, a podcast that aims to bring clarity to the concept of violence and its consequences in the lives of victims and survivor groups, as well as the perpetrators and their descendants. In this episode, Dr. Andrea Gullotta talks about the mediated cruelty, second-hand aesthetics of horror.
I'm very happy to introduce Andrea Gullotta, who is lecturer in Russian at the University of Palermo and has also worked for the University of Glasgow, the Foscari University of Venice, and the University of Padua, where he obtained his PhD. He is co-editor of the journal AvtobiografiЯ, which deals with life writing and the representation of the self in Russian culture, and Google tells me also intellectual life and literature at Solovki 1923 to 1930, the Paris of the northern concentration camps. His main research area is Gulag literature, and he has authored dozens of works on Gulag literature, Gulag poetry, and Gulag culture. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for the presentation, and a huge thank you to Pumla for inviting me here. I'll start with a little anecdote. When I received the email, and Pumla invited me to the workshop online in 2020. I remember I turned to my wife, I was like, I so want to go to South Africa, and it's online. So I'm very happy that now I am finally in this amazing country and surrounded by these amazing people. Thank you very much. So I'm also grateful to Nancy because she somehow introduced part of what I'm going to talk about, because this meeting is also about aesthetics and memory and representation and so on. I thought of introducing a part of the discussion which was also dealt with by Nancy about how narrations are made, how the material is selected and all these things. And there's one thing in particular which has interested me, and I want to talk about one piece of a wider thinking about mediums and mediators and filters of violence, but also of memory and the way that they are made aesthetic. So when we think of the representation of violence, horror, trauma, we usually think of, I don't know, an autobiography, a memoir, or so on. We forget that there are filters, there are noises, and I'm referring here to a term that is used in the communication theory, first thought about by Shannon and Weaver, but then spoke about by Jacobson, as in everything, an external input that is into the channel between the sender and the receiver, which has the potential to obscure the signal. So everything that can make the signal unclear. And in this case, I mean, the mediations, there are different mediations that can have an impact on the representation. And I want to kick off and start talking about this by reading an excerpt from a memoir written in the Gulag by a writer called Oleg Volkov. In English, it's translated as Sinking into Darkness, Погружение во тьму. But unfortunately, it's never been translated in English, so what you will hear is my translation. It's a scene that he recounts. The persistence of the sectarians drove the authorities to the limit. They would not tell the name, and the answer to all questions was all the same: God knows. They refused to work for the Antichrist, and no intimidations or beatings would induce them to serve the evil, that is, the power which had crucified Christ. Even the guards would take a step back. But the escape, this is speaking about an escape of a prisoner that happened the day before, the escape followed by the reprimands and intimidations from above triggered the zeal of the officers. And so they, the officers, drove into a corner of the zone, this is a term that refers to the area of the camp, a bunch of emaciated, ragged, and silent sectarians who were holding themselves together. They tied their hands and put them on a protruding boulder. There were about 20 people, 2 or 3 bareheaded elders, bald and with a grey beard, a few middle-aged men, torn with sunken cheeks, blackened, hunched, teenagers who were looking like poor peasants, the boys drawn by the Peredvishniki as a reference to a movement, an artistic movement, a Russian artistic movement, which often depicted peasants. And 3 middle-aged women in long dresses typical of villages, tied by kerchiefs pulled over their eyes. How could it happen that the woman sectarians were not separated but kept together with us in our zone? Maybe they brought them on purpose from the female barrack, which was close by. The commander ordered they would have to stand on the boulder until they said their name and start to work. He ordered 3 shooters not to give those bastards the possibility to move. These obstinate people were put on the mosquitoes. This is how they called in the camp this punishment provided by nature, of which Nancy was talking about yesterday. People simply should not be here. The north, the bogs, the wilderness, how could this place ever be without mosquitoes? There's nothing to do. So this is a type of torture where people were stripped naked and exposed to mosquitoes until they were bitten so many times that they would be emaciated. So they would stand, these unfortunate Christosiki, this is how this sect is called, blackened by ignorance, brightened by the faith, inaccessibly exalted by faith, tortured and ridiculed, frail but able to die for their beliefs. In vain the commander, furious, would approach them. He would rip the shirts of the disobedient. Let the mosquitoes devour these bastards. But they would stand in silence, covered by a grey shifting shroud. They wouldn't even groan. The lips slightly moved silently. I will count to 10, you bastards. If you don't go to work, I will shoot you like dogs. 1, 2. The shutters rattled. Huddling together in a group, men and women fell on their knees as if they received a command. In a discordant, hoarse choir, they sang, Christ rose from the dead. The commander frantically swears and throws himself on them with his fists up. They held them for several hours. The overseers, eaten, begged them to stop, and in the end the commander waved his hand. They can go too. And this is how the depiction of the scene of violence finishes in the book written by Oleg Volkov. Volkov was born in 1900, the son of an important naval entrepreneur, spent his youth in his family tenure, and then developed a talent for language. He became a translator for the Greek embassy and for the Associated Press until in 1928 he was arrested and sent to the Solovki camp. It was the first arrest of many. He spent until 1955 between one camp to another with a few breaks in between. And after his release, he worked for 25 years on his memoirs, a piece of which I have just read, which will be published only after the collapse of the USSR. The good thing is that before dying in 1996, aged 96, he had the joy of receiving a literary prize in 1992, a National Literary Prize, but his work remained quite unknown. In the excerpt I have read, Volkov recounts a moment of violence, describes it many years after the event takes place. The punishment of the Christosiki happens in 1929, we know this from other sources, and he wrote his memoirs between 1955 and 1980, so many, many years after this happened. So the survivor decides to write something. He selects the material. We're speaking about this before. I would like to recall a theory by Lube Jorgenson about a book zero, which is something that is written by the survivors, and it's the internal selection of events that eventually will end up in a memoir, which occurs already in the mind of the writer during the detention, and decides how to depict them. And here I recall another theory by Leona Toker about the so-called Room 101, as in the need to distort your sight, your eyes as a writer from the horror at a certain point. You're up to a certain point where you confine the horror to the Room 101, like in Orwell, 1984, and then you leave it there. So these are all typical filters, but then things become slightly complicated. Halfway through the tale, Volkov is overwhelmed by remembering the scene. Now, what you heard in the book is not the real end of the story. The real end of the story is that the Christosiki were slowly executed. there is different sources. So this event is recounted in other sources. There's a former Solovki prisoner called Rozanov who compiled a series of autobiographies about this camp where this event happened, and found pretty much the same event recounted by another person, where one of them is executed, the other are sent to the camps where they die of starvation. Other sources, anyway, depict a different way, but in any case, all these Christosiki are killed, are murdered in a way or another. But there is a limit to which Volkov pushed himself in the writing, and it's a limit that he couldn't even overcome when he had to say the story in the film. This is a film made about a Solovki prison camp by a director called Marina Goldovskaya. Now, there is a trauma, but it's not recounted. The video shows what happens when you have to speak the unspeakable. This is a clear sort of a representation of the famous sentence, speak the unspeakable. But at that point, then the question is about the medium and the mediator. When Volkov decided himself to write the story about what happened, he decided what to do with a piece of paper and how to recount the story. Here, there is a medium, there's a camera, there are microphones, and there is a mediator, the person that decides what to do with this video. Do you cut the scene? Do you put it in? Do you stop it at a certain point? And so on. So this is an example of how mediated autobiographies can actually provide a different type of point of view about the experience of trauma and about the experience of the aestheticization of violence. Another example, if we stick to the problem of technology, so this is a case of technology, and part of the technology, and it's related to, in general, the interview. So this, of course, was an interview. But when you make an interview, create a narration, you as an interviewer, right? You choose what the questions are. You try to drive it. Well, as a teacher, sometimes during the exams, I tell students, choose a topic of your own. And usually this is the worst question that you can ask a student, to choose a topic on their own, because they need a direction. And this is what the interviewer does. But then there's all the technical side to it. For example, is the person at ease to speak at in front of a microphone? How does your question shape the story? How does your question change the way in which things are recounted? Are there some performative sides to the way that they speak once they do it in front of a camera or during an interview and so on? And these, of course, are all things that have to deal directly with the way that the narrative comes out. If we stick quickly, just very briefly, to the technology, Cesar, how much time do I have? 10, 11 minutes. Okay, I will skip this. I wanted to show you something else related to technology, but I don't think I have time. So I will just skip to the topic, the main topic of the talk that I want to talk about today, which is what happens when the mediator is a person, when there is a person that has the role of sort of carrying the experience of the other person. I know in this room there's people that have helped other people explaining and talking about an experience of violence. So Bettina Sturm, when she helped writing the memories of Rodia Chandler, an Holocaust survivor, she wrote this: "The memoir that emerged between us was titled A Long Labor, a fitting name given the arduous process of our collaboration and the many ethical dilemmas it raised for me. Some of these dilemmas had to do with the narrative process. Which questions were helpful to draw out Rodia's story, and which ones diverted the story because they contained my own directives and assumptions? Where did my textbook knowledge of Holocaust history and my emotional identification with Rodia's suffering complicate my ability to listen and respond to a narrative? Equally concerning in my experience were the relational dilemmas that underpin the narrative process. How was I to see and relate to Rodia's ethically in light of her traumatic experiences? How could I encourage reciprocal dialogue between us, being mindful of her vulnerable position and our significant differences, while still engaging fully and openly with the real and dynamic woman in front of me? In short, how was I to navigate the relational space between us? This question of how to relate or navigate relational space in order to bear witness to another person's suffering and story is, to my mind, a question of ethical responsibility, one that shapes how we receive, respond to, and recount the narrative of others. And after making this, speaking about this, I wanted to talk about two concrete experiences, two concrete cases. One happens when two Polish poets meet in America. I introduced them because I'm not sure that in South Africa you're familiar with Polish literature, but one of them is Aleksander Chwat, original name Chwat, very, very influential Polish poet, one of the main names of futurism and in general of Polish modernism, who in 1940 was arrested, even though he was a convinced communist, deported to Siberia, actually to Kazakhstan, for 6 years, then returned heavily traumatized until in 1959 he managed to escape. He went to France initially, and then he was invited in Berkeley, and he taught Polish literature in Berkeley from 1963. And at that point, another Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz, who eventually won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1980, went to see him. He was in America too, an exiled poet. And he went there because he wanted to preserve Chwat's experience. He knew that Chwat was a fundamental poet. So they had very long discussions, out of which came a mediated autobiography called Mój wiek, My Century, which is the only testimonial first singular person experience in which Chwat recounted his experience. And soon after the recording finished, Chwat committed suicide in 1967. Miłosz says clearly that he does it only because it's Chwat. And there is a connection. Marinelli, Luigi Marinelli is a Polish scholar in Italy, who created the Italian version, says it's not a memoir, it's not an autobiography, it's not a novel, it's not an essay, it's a bit of all of this. And Miłosz is fully aware of that. He says it is not a collaborative autobiography. And Miłosz says, I am not a collaborator. I'm not collaborating in this autobiography, I'm inspiring it. And you guess it from the questions. The questions by Miłosz are, in what year did Hempel die? So it tries to elicit information that are missing. The same thing happened in 1930s, and again with Mayakovsky, so he introduces topics because he knows that Chwat can expand on that. Sorry, I need a bit of background. I don't remember well what happened with Bruno Jasiński and his poems. That's where he feels that the reader will need additional information. Chwat dialogues with him. And slowly you can see in the text that the reaction, he actually responds to this sort of inputs that Miłosz gave him. Lviv was one of the most beautiful Polish city, a happy town. Did you ever see it before the war? So there is this sort of interaction and empathy. At this point in time, my prison experience starts, but to be honest, I don't know if I'm going to talk about them here. There have already been too many descriptions of prisons, and mine can be only interesting because they have been internalized and are seen through the prism of my specific life events. So he engages with his own experience because he has the input from Miłosz. And Miłosz does help him to express that. So for example, when it comes to trauma, Miłosz triggers the experience and then completely disappears. He sort of let him start the discussion, and when he starts the discussion and gets into his story, Miłosz simply disappears. The longest pieces are the ones when just Miłosz takes a step back and only does interventions like, how did you know it was locked? When there's something, information missing that the reader needs to understand. So Chwat had not written a memoir before the conversation with Miłosz, who, as a fellow poet, understood that Chwat needed someone who could understand him in order to be able to speak. So Miłosz states clearly that he's aware of his role as a mediator, and he says that the conversation is rewritten, but his work is done with a pencil, not with a pen, and that anything he does is done thinking only of the interest of future generations. So he felt that Chwat was lesser known. He gained his trust, and he did everything he could to make sure that people could know more about Vat and his experience. And this is something that happens with the second case I want to talk to you about, which is the case of Shalamov, the fantastic writer of which we've heard more than once in these days, and Irina Siratinskaya. Irina Siratinskaya is not particularly known as a person apart from the group of Shalamovyedi, of specialists of Shalamov. So Shalamov was born in 1907 in the family of a priest. He was particularly active in the literary environment of Moscow and also in politics, but unfortunately on the wrong side. He was a Trotskyist, and he started as a poet. He was arrested in 1929, spent many, many years in the camps, especially in the horrible camps of the Kolyma, from which he took out lots of poems which he composed orally during the detention and then afterwards, but also in the forms of short tales which he eventually put together in what became his masterpiece, the Kolyma Tales, Raskalimsky Raskazy, which are today considered one of the masterpieces of Russian literature overall. But when Siratinskaya meets Shalamov, Siratinskaya is not a poet, she's an archivist. She meets Shalamov by chance in an archive, and she understands that she has a poet in front of her, a great poet who's completely unknown. They develop a very close relationship which lasts from 1967 until his death in 1982. But when Shalamov dies in 1982, he is completely unknown. He's known to a very small circle of people who read his works in clandestine literature, and to few people who read his poems published every now and then in official Soviet journals which have nothing to do or they have only hints of his experience in the camp. His masterpiece is known to no one apart from those who read clandestine literature. And so when he dies in 1982, he dies a lonely man, blind, completely abandoned by everyone. And Siratinskaya in 1981 starts writing a mediated autobiography trying to convey the greatness of the character that is standing in front of her and trying to retain as much as possible information about Shalamov's art. And so she feels like Shalamov deserves more fame, and she depicts his private image, his cats, his interest for money, all different things related to his life, and she also shows how important details about his writing process. And actually, she triggers what will become the manifesto of Shalamov's poetry, which is a letter that he writes in response to her when she says, you should edit your tales after you write them because they're too raw, too cruel. And then he develops the poetics of the slap, the tale like a slap in the face of Stalinism. And this, which was written as a letter to her, became eventually known as his most important contribution to his theorization of prose writing. Siratinskaya, when she recounts this, she writes this thinking that no one knows about him, so she tries to keep it. But she also keeps on writing down pieces about her role in there. So every tale, every sentence is first yelled in an empty room. This is what Shalamov says to her. I always talk with myself when I write. I scream, I curse, I cry, and I can't stop my tears. And only after it's finished, I dry my tears. And Irina Siratinskaya writes about this. He was a wonderful narrator. My eyes used to see his past. I can still hear his voice toning down, the rhythm of the narration slowing down towards the end, when the tale reached its acme. His eyes would sparkle, his body seemed to stretch, and like a shot came the ending sentence. This is what eventually was identified by Alfred Gall as the laconism, which is typical of Shalamov's writing. But then things don't mix up, because if his writing process was the one of screaming, yelling, and how can we put this image together with this image of him reading to him, toning down the voice and everything else? So questions are raised by how did she do the role of the mediator? She definitely did convey the image of Shalamov and the beginning somehow of what we know about Shalamov as a writer comes from what Siratinskaya told us in large part about her conversations with him, but also at the same time seems like she's trying to put herself in the picture in a way. And this is something that is quite maliciously said by a few people, but I would like to say that anyway, it doesn't change the fact that as a mediator she did the job. she definitely conveyed the autobiography and the experiences of Shalamov to the public in a moment where no one knew about Shalamov, only very few. It's Goldovskaya that decided to put this image in the film. She could have cut it, but as a mediator of memory, she felt that this was an important moment. She decided to include it in this film, which was made specifically to foster memory of the Solovki prison camp. It's Miloš who understands that Vat has a unique life experience and goes to Berkeley to meet him, and actually does it just in time before he commits suicide, that as a mediator conveys this representation. It's Siratinskaya who feels that Shalamov is going to die and writes down the conversation and tries to put him into the picture of Russian literature. These are all examples of mediation. Is there a noise? Yes. Are there filters? Yes. This is the way that Goldovskaya wanted to say, not the way that Volkov wanted to say, but still the message is conveyed. And I do wonder also, on ending on a personal note, is it also what we do as researchers when we choose our topics in the realm of trauma? I don't have an answer to this. I hope you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more, you can check out our website.